I am preaching today from the book of Joel, or Joel. Can I have the slides up, please? The book of Joel is not a book that people often preach from. But why am I preaching from it? Number one, it's to really tie in with the season of prayer and fasting that we are in. As we look at the text later, we realize that Joel calls Israel to prayer and fasting in response to the national events and crises that were happening during his generation. The second reason is that I actually felt that was quickened to me by the Lord about 2 weeks ago, as Pastor Les was standing here at his first sermon of the year. And I was just standing over there, and he was ending his sermon and praying for us. And I just felt the name of that book drop in my heart. And I knew I was going to preach this week, but that really wasn't on my radar at all. I was thinking of preaching on something else, but the name of that book just dropped upon my heart. I believe there's something from this book that even as we start this year, God will want our church to look at, to learn from. And the third thing, of course, is that you realize that Joel is the prophet of the day of the Lord. He's known as the prophet of the day of the Lord, or the prophet of the Lord's judgment in the Old Testament. I'll explain more of this later, but I believe he offers instruction for us, especially as we individually and corporately prepare our church and ourselves for the coming days. I'll share a verse before we start. Before Joel, many of us know the passage in Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus was on the Mount of Olives. And it says in Matthew 24, verses 3 to 8, it says the disciples came to him saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus told his disciples that, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation describe a series of successive judgments coming upon the earth that will increase in frequency and intensity before the Lord returns. Jesus used the word birth pangs or birth pains to help us understand this. And the prophet Joel depicts an Old Testament parallel or precursor of these judgments. And he actually gives us a picture of how to respond when we are facing that day. In other words, Joel had a foretaste during his time of what would happen during the generation before the Lord returns. And he helps us to navigate the seemingly confusing and contradictory events that are happening around us now and will happen increasingly before the Lord returns. And so I believe he can help us to prepare for some of the dangers that believers will encounter during that time. Some of the dangers that Jesus warns us of: there's a risk of deception. There'll be false Christs, false prophets will arise and deceive many. There will be spiritual weariness, because he says the hearts of many believers will grow cold, tired, and weary as they are persecuted for their beliefs, and as wave after wave of judgments and evil are revealed. I think for many of us, even as we start this year, we think about 2022, it already seems like this will be, we already carry with it a sense of weariness from what we've faced the last 2 years. And I believe we need to find perspective from God's word to help us navigate through this time. Amen? There is also a risk that Jesus highlights, which is the risk of disappointment and offense in the last days. The risk of disappointment and offense. When believers misunderstand the events and fall away because God doesn't seem to come true for them or do what they assume he should do. And so the word of the Lord came to Joel as his nation faced these similar disasters. And it was not something they had seen before, but God spoke through Joel. and told them, return to the Lord with all your heart as you face all these coming crises. That's a summary of our passage today. Return to the Lord with all your heart as you face these coming crises. In other words, Joel advised the people of his day to turn back to God, put Him first, remove the spiritual and moral compromise, remove that spiritual apathy and passivity from your life, and love Him with all of your heart. To put it another way, I believe what we learn from the book of Joel is that casual and convenient Christianity might make you a casualty in the day before the Lord returns. Casual and convenient Christianity might make you a casualty in the season before the Lord returns. That was the advice that God gave through the prophet Joel. Before we read our passage today, it's helpful to understand the structure of our book. Once you see the structure, it's much easier for you to tag along. It's a prophetic book, so sometimes the language is a bit more it's a bit more flowery in that sense. But this is the structure of the book. There are 3 chapters in the book. The first chapter speaks about a locust invasion. The second chapter speaks of a military invasion. And the third chapter speaks of what we call the valley of decision, or the final day of the Lord. So 3 chapters, 3 incidents. And today we're not going to look at chapter 3. We're just going to look at chapters 1 and 2. And we're going to glean some insights for our day as we go through this book. So we're going to read from Joel chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 17. Okay, Joel chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 17. Can I invite us to just read along? It's a bit of a long passage, but I believe it helps us to understand and engage with God's word as we read along, okay? So let's read this together. 1, 2, 3. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders. Give ear, all the inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days, or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. Awake, you drunkards, and weep and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the sweet wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come against my land, powerful and beyond number. Its teeth are like lion's teeth, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vine and splintered my fig tree. It has stripped off her bark and thrown it down. Their branches are made white. Lament like a virgin wearing sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn, the ministers of the Lord. The fields are destroyed, the ground mourns because the grain is destroyed. The wine dries up and the oil languishes. Be ashamed, O tillers of the soil. Wail, O vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. The vine dries up, the fig tree languishes, pomegranate, palm, and apple. All the trees of the field are dried up, and gladness dries up from the children of men. Put on sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Go in, pass the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, because grain offering and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Alas, for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. Is not the food cut off from before my eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? The seed shrivels under the clods. The storehouses are desolate. The granaries are torn down because the grain has dried up. How the beasts groan. The herds of cattle are perplexed because there is no pasture for them. Even the flocks of sheep suffer. To you, O Lord, I call, for fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and flame has devoured all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you, because the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy temple. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble. For the day of the Lord is coming, it is near. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Like blackness there is spread upon the mountains a great and powerful people. Their like has never been before, nor will there be again after them through the years of all generations. We're at chapter 2 already, the invasion. Fire devours from before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but behind them a desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses. Like wild horses they run. As with the rumbling of chariots, they leap on the tops of the mountains, like the crackling of a flame of fire devouring the stubble, like a powerful army drawn up for battle. Before them, the peoples are in anguish, all faces grow pale. Like warriors they charge, like soldiers they scale the wall. They march each on his own way. They do not swerve from their paths. They do not jostle with one another. Each marches in his path. They burst through the weapons and are not halted. They leap upon the city, they run upon the walls, they climb up into houses, they enter through the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. The Lord utters his voice before his army, for his camp is exceedingly great. He who executes his word is powerful. For the day of the Lord is great and very awesome. Who can endure it? Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. He relents over disaster. Who knows whether he will not turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, consecrate the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children, even the nursing infants. Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber. Between the vestibule and the altar, let the priests, the ministers of the Lord, weep and say, spare your people, O God, and make not your heritage a reproach, a byword among the nations. Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? There are three sections to today's sermon. First, I will look at the two invasions. We read chapter 1 and chapter 2 just now. There are two invasions. And we'll look at the concept of the day of the Lord. And finally, we'll look at God's remedy and restoration for that generation. The two invasions. Verse 1 tells us that the word of the Lord came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Who is Joel? Not much is actually known about him. Joel or Yoel in Hebrew simply means Yahweh is God. Biblical scholars aren't exactly sure when this book was written. They're not fully sure, but most likely it was during the 9th century, during the time of King Joash. And it was a period of treachery and backsliding. Idolatry was common in the land, and there was a manipulative woman named Athaliah. You see this in 2 Kings chapter 11. This lady usurped the throne and tried to kill all the royal descendants of David. The high priest at that time took the king's remaining son, Joash, and hid him for a season. Eventually, Athaliah was removed, the queen was removed, and Joash was installed as the king. But he was only 7 years old during that time. So in effect, the priests and the other leaders, the elders of the land, were the ones governing the nation until the king came of age. So that's why you see in this book, the prophet calls out, he does not name the king or mention the king, but he addresses the priests and the elders many times. And even though the actions of the priests brought some peace to the land, there were other things, areas in life of Israel that were compromised. And God was actually calling that nation back to a fuller repentance. So that was the context of what was happening as we look at the book of Joel. And so we come to chapter 1 and we see a locust invasion. That's the first incident that happened in chapter 1. A locust invasion that struck the nation. And we see that it was a destructive, unusually destructive invasion. Firstly, we see in verses 2 and 3 that it was an unprecedented generational event. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your fathers? It doesn't mean that a locust invasion had never happened before historically, but that for the people of Joel's day, it was not something they had ever experienced. It was unprecedented, not because there were no locust plague before, but it was unprecedented in its size and scale for that generation when Joel was living in. And it was something so unusual that they would tell their children and their grandchildren about. That's what verse 3 tells us. But the scary thing is this, that it was a locust invasion that came in multiple waves. You see in verse 4, what the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. What the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. It was just 4 waves of locust invasion, plagues that attacked the nation, one after another. I don't know if any of you have seen videos of locust swarms before, but it is a terrifying scene. Large locust swarms would look like a giant moving cloud across the land that left a trail of destroyed vegetation. The largest locust swarms in history have been recorded to cover more than 1,000 square kilometers. 1,000 square kilometers. Singapore, the entire Singapore, is only 720 square kilometers. And each swarm can literally have several billion insects because they produce at a very rapid rate. One single female locust laying her eggs could potentially result in 18 million offspring within 4 months, which would start another locust wave as we look at our text. And the scary thing is that as these locusts pass by the land, each locust can eat its own weight in plants each day. And a swarm of just 1 square kilometer can eat the same amount of food as 35,000 people in 1 day. Imagine them doing that, going to the next day, the next day, the next day. That was the kind of destruction that happened. And it didn't just happen once, it happened wave after wave after wave after wave. And so we can immediately imagine and realize the kind of agricultural and economic disaster that the locusts left behind. As we read just now, in verse 5, the wine was cut off. The vine and fig tree were destroyed. The grain and the wine offerings were cut off. The fields were destroyed. The harvest perished. The pomegranate, the palm, and the apple, all the trees in the field dried up. And verse 16 in chapter 1 told us that there was famine. It's not the food cut off from before our eyes. And we realize that this unprecedented generational event also disrupted worship at God's temple. In verses 9 and 13, it tells us that grain and wine offerings are cut off or withheld from the house of the Lord. And many of us reading this, it just means that you think that just means that the priests have no food lah. But it's not just that. Grain and wine were used in the daily offerings made to God in the temple. And so when they say that the grain and wine was cut off, it means the daily offerings to God, the daily ministrations of the priests were cut off from God's worship. The worship in the temple was disrupted by this locust plague, which is also why the priests were called to cry out and to mourn. And the most disturbing thing for us, even as we think about this, is that the disaster occurred over a few years. It did not pass quickly. The duration of this locust and its impact didn't just last for a few days or a few weeks or a few months, as some of us might prefer. Because as one wave ended, another wave came. As another wave ended, the other one came. And one of the most well-known and comforting verses from the book of Joel actually indicates to us the duration of this locust invasion. In chapter 2, verse 25, I think many of us have spoken this to one another, prayed this for one another. Joel said, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, the cutting locust. I will restore to you the years that the locusts have consumed. So this unprecedented thing lasted years. I think some of us listening to this immediately, I think we can kind of relate as we look at the events of the past 2 years. It seems like wave after wave after wave, and the authorities tell us good news, and then things happen again, and we've been through this up and down season for years. And I believe even as we look at this, we can understand how the people felt during that time. Surely it would have been easier to feel discouraged. Maybe some of the people at that time, just even though it was an unprecedented event, some people would have thought it was just a random act of nature. Or maybe in our Singaporean terms, you're unlucky lah, you suay lah, you lived during that time. Some of them might just think, I just hope this passes quickly. Maybe some people might even think, this can't be God. How can God allow this? But if we know the history of Israel, we know that they were a nation set apart by God. And they had the law and the commandments. They had the word of God. And so we realize that even the people of Joel's day, the truth is that they should have known, or at least the priests, the elders, and the religious people should have known that this was from the Lord, because locusts were associated with judgment in the Old Testament. They will remember the incident during the time of Moses in Exodus chapter 10, when God judged the nation of Egypt by sending a plague of locusts, a plague that covered the skies and made the skies dark and that pillaged Egypt during that time. Furthermore, in Deuteronomy 28, the famous chapter where Moses gives the covenant and the blessings and curses of the covenant, locust devastation was one of the punishments for disobedience against the Lord. Deuteronomy 28:38, Moses said, if you disobey the Lord, you will carry much seed into the field, meaning you sow a lot of things, but you gather little, for the locusts shall consume it. And so if the people forgot all about Moses' law, God was using an unusual and unprecedented generational event, an agricultural disaster, to get their attention and to remind them of His word, that they had drifted away from God and God was calling them back to repentance. And that was why God was telling the people, God told the people, and Joel told the people in 1:15 that the calamity was from the Lord. For the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. But this wasn't the only thing that happened. As Joel began to prophesy, he suddenly shifted his time, his vision to the future, and he began to prophesy of another attack in chapter 2. But this time it was a military invasion by an army that behaved like locusts. In chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, he says, blow a trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm, let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, like blackness, like locusts, like blackness that is spread upon the mountains, a great and powerful people. Their like had never been seen before, nor will there be after them throughout the years of all generations. This was a military invasion, but it will be another unprecedented generational event. Something in verse 2 tells us that they had not seen before. And this army would be destructive, like the locusts that they saw in chapter 1. It will be like blackness. The land before them in chapter 2, verse 3, will be like the Garden of Eden. But after they pass through the land, it will be a desolate wilderness. However, it's very clear that some of us may think, isn't this like a locust? No, because the descriptions in chapter 2, if you look at it carefully, describe many human actions. This army can charge. This army can scale walls. This army can march and leap and run and climb. Joel had shifted his focus to talk about a military invasion, but this army was like a destructive locust army. The third thing about this army is that they were swift and disciplined warriors. We look from verses 4 to 9, they talk about them being nimble, them being focused. They will not break ranks. This army will be not just destructive, but they will be swift and disciplined and uncompromising warriors. But the surprise comes in verse 11. Joel chapter 2, verse 11. Suddenly, Joel says, the Lord utters his voice before his army, for his camp is exceedingly great. He who executes his word is powerful. Joel suddenly describes this enemy army as being headed by the God of Israel himself. And the army, we see in verse 11, is there to execute God's word. And so commentators have sometimes struggled with this text. Some have gone to the extent to suggest that this is a picture of a holy army, an army that is doing good on behalf of God. There's certain groups of people that kind of think of this as the army of the Lord. But the context is clear that this is a destructive and ruthless army sent to invade Zion or Jerusalem. In other words, God was using a wicked human army, which was likely driven by their own greed, ambition, self-interest, just like any human army, their own national interests, to discipline his own people. God can use wicked forces or armies to discipline and to purify his people, but God will judge the army in the end. I think a question that comes to us as we look at Joel chapter 2 is that this idea, can God use evil for good? Let me be clear, okay? Let me be clear. The Bible tells us, the Bible is clear. It tells us that God does not sin and he does no evil. God does not sin and he does no evil. But a wise God can sometimes he does use the sin existing in our world to fulfill his purposes. I think the best example is the death of Jesus at the cross. There's a divine mystery about the death of Christ on the cross, because we know that it was Satan who inspired Judas to betray Jesus. Jesus was unjustly tried and condemned to crucifixion by rulers who had political and personal agendas. The ruthless Roman soldiers beat him, mocked him, and crucified him out of their own violent hearts. And yet, through this death on the cross, Jesus atoned for our sin and brought salvation to us all. Some people have wondered, some theologians have wondered over the years, why did Satan really know what he was doing? Why did Satan push Jesus to the cross if that was going to mean salvation for so many people? Some of our younger people, maybe they play games, they think this is end game. You do that, actually, it's end game for yourself. You make yourself lose, right? And one explanation, and I think it's a good one, that thinkers have come up with is that God actually allowed Satan to overplay his hand. God allowed Satan to overplay his hand. God allowed Satan to express his anger, his fury to the Son of God like never before. I think many of us can imagine the pent-up hatred and anger that Satan had toward God and toward his Son. And in that moment, Satan decided to just unleash and, in a sense, what we say, whack as hard as he could. God allowed Satan an opportunity to display his wickedness and his rage, but God turned it around to fulfill his purposes. And similarly, God can sometimes turn and use the sinful and wicked actions of man and turn them around to fulfill his purposes. And that is something that he will do in the last days. Joel doesn't tell us when this event happened, but the closest historical parallel we can find is the Babylonian invasion that came in 3 successive waves in the 6th century. The Babylonians even had a scorched earth policy where they would strip and destroy the cities and places they had conquered, much like the locusts. And the prophet Jeremiah actually prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar, that ruthless king, will be used as God's servant to discipline his nation. This doesn't mean that God approves of every method that was used. In fact, we know that God eventually judged Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon for their violence and evil. But as we look at these 2 chapters together, we realize that the invasion in chapter 1 was actually like a sign or a signpost to Israel to warn the people of the military invasion that would come in chapter 2. And this also tells us that the invasion in chapter 1 and 2 is meant to prepare and warn us about the final day of the Lord battle in chapter 3. Let us look more closely at this idea of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. The theme of the day of the Lord runs through the book of Joel, and it's specifically mentioned 5 times in this book, which is more than any other prophet or writer in the Bible. This is why Joel is sometimes referred to as the prophet of the day of the Lord. And I've already mentioned that there are 3 events described in the book, spread across 3 chapters. And the thing is, Joel describes all these 3 events as the day of the Lord. All these 3 events are the day of the Lord. But as we look at these events carefully, we realize that the first 2 are kind of like smaller days of the Lord. And they point to the final day of the Lord where the nations will gather for war. The small day of the Lord in chapter 1, chapter 2 is meant to prepare us for chapter 3. They are kind of like the birth pangs before the final day. And to use an example from our Singaporean military, those of us, the men in combat units, infantry units, and army units, you know that the final exercise for our army's combat units is something called ATAC. At the end of 2 years, there's ATAC 1, ATAC 2. And the final exercise will be like the climax of 2 years of military training and all that suffering and field camps that you need to go through. It will culminate in that final exercise. But to prepare the battalion for the exercise, there will be many exercises of a similar nature before ATAC in order to give the soldiers a taste of what will happen and to prepare them. So in that sense, chapters 1 and chapter 2 are to give us a foretaste of what will happen during the great and awesome day of the Lord. What is the day of the Lord, you may ask? In the book of Joel, the day of the Lord speaks of a time when God will unleash his judgment upon the nations. The other prophets also speak of this day. The prophet Isaiah tells us that it will be a day when God punishes the proud. Prophet Obadiah tells us that the day of the Lord will be a time of retribution for the wicked. Ezekiel tells us that it will be a time of war and great destruction. But in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul told the Thessalonians of that day, "For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as what? Labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. In other words, Paul told them that the day of the Lord will come. For you, those of you in the New Testament, will come like a thief in the night. People will say there's peace, but like labor pains, it will come. But you believers, it should not surprise you. Amen? And for us, it should not surprise us. We should be prepared. In the ancient Near East, during Joel's time, in the Mesopotamian region, there will be a yearly enthronement festival in that culture, not in the Hebrew culture, but in the Mesopotamian culture of that time. There will be a yearly enthronement festival for the king of their gods. And during that time, the deity will determine the destiny of his subjects during that time and establish order over chaos. That was what the people in the ancient Near East believed in that region where Joel prophesied in. And some scholars believe that when the Old Testament prophets used this term, the day of the Lord or day of Yahweh, the people in their cultural background would have understood that to refer to the day when Yahweh will ascend to the throne and bring justice to the world. One Old Testament scholar puts it this way: the day of Yahweh, he's talking about purely in the Old Testament context, the day of Yahweh refers to the occasion when Yahweh will ascend to his throne with the purpose of binding chaos and bringing justice to the world order. Binding chaos and bringing justice to the world order. They will know that the God of Israel will come and he will exercise his authority as king to bind chaos and to bring justice. And for us in the New Testament, we can take it to refer to the time when God will come in his authority as king and begin to establish his reign over the earth and to bring judgment and justice to the earth. It corresponds to the time of God's judgment and wrath that is often called the Great Tribulation or the 7-year tribulation that Pastor Leslie has been teaching about. But how will the day of the Lord be different? There are significant differences. It will be a time when God shifts from his normal mode of leadership. It will be a time when God shifts from his normal mode of leadership to openly confront sin and rebellion as the King of Kings. Let me say that again. It will be a time when God shifts from his normal mode of leadership to openly confront sin and rebellion as the King of Kings. God's usual way of leadership over the earth right now, most of the time, is to patiently restrain his greater judgments against sin so that more can repent. The Apostle Peter tells us this in 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3, he says in verse 3, he warns us, scoffers will come in the last day and they will say, where is the promise of his coming? You Christians have been talking about his coming. Where is the promise of his coming? He's not coming, you guys are lying. And verse 9, Peter gives us the rationale why God is doing that. He said that the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. In other words, people say, why is the day of the Lord taking so long? Why doesn't God come? You guys are lying. No. Peter said, no. God is not slow. He's delaying that, or he's being patient so that people will turn and find repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. And when that comes, the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. So when that day comes, God's default way of leadership will be to publicly exercise his authority over wickedness, over the ungodly, and over the unrepentant rulers of the earth. But he holds that back now so that we can turn. We can turn. people can turn to him. But in that day, it will be a public demonstration of his authority. Just like in the days of Moses before Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, there'll be public demonstrations of God's supernatural power and judgments over nations and over earthly authorities. We see that in the book of Revelation. So my friends, as we've talked a lot, but as we go through this and we look at chapters 1 and 2, I invite us to think about this and to really consider how you view the God of the Bible. If your view of God is not based on the full revelation of the Scriptures, if your view of God is not based on the full Word of God, the Word of God that God has given us, then if you could end up being stumbled on that day. If your view of God has only room for God's patience and God's grace and God's hyper grace, in that day you might be stumbled. You will not be able to recognize God in that day if you have been trained or you have trained yourself to skim over or to ignore the parts of the Bible that speak of God's holiness and God's judgment. You will stumble in that day. But I invite us, our friends, to really grapple and take hold of this word and eat this book and take hold of it and believe the full revelation that God has given to us. Amen? The prophets tell us that God will be revealed as a great and awesome king in that day. The great and awesome king. It will be a day where his holiness, which what Pastor Les preached on last week, his righteousness and justice will be revealed, but it will also be a day that is considered awesome or fearsome or terrible. Why? Because there are three factors that will culminate and reach their climax during that time. Why is it a great and awesome day of the Lord? Number one, there will be divine judgment unleashed on the earth like never before. Divine judgment will be unleashed on the earth like never before. Second thing, satanic deception will be unleashed at unprecedented levels. Jesus says, be careful of false prophets and false teachers. Pastor Les will start preaching on Revelation in February. We'll talk about the Antichrist and the false prophet will do false signs and wonders. So there'll be divine activity of God's power being revealed at unprecedented levels, but there'll be satanic deception operating at a level that the earth has not seen before. And the third thing is that human evil, the wickedness of human hearts, will reach its climax. Humanity will reap the fruit of her actions and her decisions. Her greed, her selfishness, her pride, her rejection of God's moral law, that will reach its climax. People will reject and hate the moral law of God and will hate even Christians. Human pride and rebellion against God will ultimately be embodied in a man, a false savior called the Antichrist, whom the movers and the shakers of the world will applaud. But we don't need to be deceived and we can be prepared. Amen? Let's remember what will happen in that day. Divine activity at unprecedented levels. Satanic deception at an unprecedented level. Human evil and pride will reach its climax. Every sphere of human life will be affected in the day of the Lord. There will be unusual events that happen in nature and creation. The family unit will be challenged. Jesus says that families will be threatened with disunity and will betray one another, even within their own families. There'll be economic upheavals. There'll be military disturbances and wars. There'll be political turmoil across the earth. And as a result of that, many people will be hardened in their attitude toward God. But many will also be confused and bewildered by what will happen. But God's people need not be confused. Amen? Some of us may ask, don't we take a pre-tribulation view of the time of judgment? Doesn't Pastor Leslie be teaching about that? And yes, maybe we may not experience the final day of the Lord. But just as the people in Joel's day, they experienced certain days of the Lord before the final one. And we will likely experience smaller days of the Lord, birth pangs that increase in frequency and intensity as we approach the last days. And I believe some of us have already felt the brunt of that in these last 2 years. And so we need to prepare ourselves with understanding. Our final section talks about God's remedy and restoration. Joel offers us wisdom and hope as we consider these events. What was the prophet's advice to the people during a time of crisis? In chapter 1, he told them, "Put on sackcloth and lament, O priests. Consecrate a fast and call a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and inhabitants of the land and cry out to the Lord." The prophet tells the priest to wear the attire of someone in grief. There are many places in the Bible where someone would tear their garments and put on sackcloth to express their grief. And they will call a fast and have a solemn assembly to gather the people for prayer, for fasting, and for repentance. And the advice in chapter 2 is similar, but Joel elaborates further. In chapter 2, verses 12 to 13, "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning." If you look at verse 12, it's actually the first time in the entire book that God speaks in the first person. It's the first time in the entire book that God speaks in the first person. And God says, "Yet even now, yet even in this crisis, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, weeping, and mourning." And it says in verse 13, "Rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster." Why did God say rend your hearts and not your garments in chapter 2? It seems like the repentance in chapter 1 was just superficial. They talk and they cry out, but God said, no. You're following through the motions, but I realize, I know, I discern that you have that outward expression of tearing your hearts, but you have not had that heartfelt repentance. And I want you to return. And it says the word return twice. Return to me with all your heart. Return to the Lord your God. God wanted a deep inward turning toward God, a deep repentance from their sin, both national and personal. And you see at the bottom of verse 13, it's actually a reminder of the covenant that God made with them through Moses. God told Moses that he was a merciful and gracious God. He was slow to anger. He was abounding in steadfast love. Joel was reminding the people, remember, God has a covenant with you. Turn back to him and he promises to restore you. And in verse 14, Joel dangles a divine what if before the people of God during a time of crisis. Who knows? As you do that, return, who knows whether he will not turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. In other words, Joel leaves open the possibility that God will relent and show mercy. In other words, God was calling the people to pray and to repent, to turn with him with all their hearts and leave the results to him. There are times where he chooses not to relent because of extreme wickedness that he has to punish and restrain, but there are times where he will surprise us and he will turn away what we think is certain judgment. Our job is to turn to him in fasting, in prayer, and in wholehearted devotion. Who knows whether he will turn and relent and leave a blessing behind. The last part of Joel chapter 2 has a very quick shift in mood. We didn't read that, but it's familiar to many of us. But it speaks of the restoration of God. And God immediately, from verses 18 to 27, starts to restore them. And he says that it says that, behold, I am sending you grain and oil and wine again, and you will be satisfied. I will drive out the enemy from your midst. I will send abundant rain, and I will restore to you the years the locusts have eaten. And that was partially fulfilled when the Jews were brought out of captivity and back to Jerusalem. So God gave them a physical and a national restoration. But the second half, or the last part, the last few verses of Joel 2 tells us of a spiritual restoration. Joel prophesies of the outpouring of the Spirit, which was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. Verse 28, it shall come to pass that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. The Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 2 quotes Joel chapter 2 verbatim, almost verbatim. Why was there a need for the gift of the Spirit? Because it represented a spiritual restoration. In the Old Testament, people's hearts kept drifting away because of the hardness of their hearts. But one day, God would send His Spirit to dwell in them and help them to obey God wholeheartedly. That's why God's call to them in verse 12 was to return to me with all your heart. Rend your hearts and not your garments. God was after a change of heart, and He eventually sent His Spirit to help them. Amen. We've talked a lot. Talked about the two invasions, the day of the Lord and God's remedy. But what does that mean for us today? Even as we come to a close, I think, how do we apply Joel chapter 1 and 2 for our lives today, and even during this time of fasting and prayer in Rock of Ages Church? Imagine with me if you were going on a trip to a country that you had never been to before. None of your friends have ever been there. There's not much information you can find about it online. You just know that you're supposed to go to this place, but you have no understanding of the climate, the people there, what hotels will be there. You have no understanding of that. It's uncharted territory. What would you pack? What will you pack if you had to go to a place like that? I believe in some sense that is much like the journey we have ahead of us as we await the coming of the Lord. The Bible gives us a big picture of what will happen, but the specifics of what will happen this year, next year, the year after, we may not know. But if Joel, the prophet Joel, were with us today, if he was standing here with us, I believe his advice, his packing list for us would include some of these things. And these are lessons that he learned from his generation. Things that will help us as we journey into this uncharted territory. We spent quite a bit of time looking at the two invasions and the day of the Lord. Why? Because we need to be prepared with understanding. As we look at the coming days, God's people need to be prepared with understanding. We need to have biblical and theological clarity about what God is doing. Many people in Israel interpreted the agricultural crisis just as a natural disaster, but it was an unprecedented one, but they couldn't see. But as we face the unusual and unprecedented events of our days, we should, as God's people, pay attention. And even as we look at COVID and the season around us, is it God? Is it man? Is it Satan? Is it divine judgment? Is it the wickedness of humanity? Is it the failures and greed of humankind? Is it the attack of Satan? And if we understand the book of Joel, we realize that all these factors play a part. All these factors play a part. But we know why God is doing this. God is allowing these things to happen so that God's people will pay attention and will be prepared for what's coming. He's trying to prepare us and let us know that He is coming as a king, and He'll begin to judge evil and bring justice to the world. God's people can be prepared with understanding, and we don't need to be confused. We looked at God's remedy and restoration. Why? Because we need to be ready for prayer. In both crises, Joel's remedy was prayer. And it was strong intercessory prayer. Weep, wail, cry out to God, add fasting to it. It was aggressive prayer. It was deep, heartfelt prayer. It wasn't the kind of silent, passive, contemplative prayer. There's a place for that in your devotions, but God was calling them during that time. When you're facing those crises, learn to have a posture of intercession. Learn to have a posture that you know how to pray and you cry out to the Lord in that day. What if God will respond? God may and God will respond to some of the things, and God may respond to our prayers. Even in the worst of situations, we think it's impossible. God may send a divine what if. And we know in the end of chapter 2, he was so quick and pleased to turn and to show mercy to God's people when they pray. The last thing is we need to be consecrated for wholeheartedness. We need to be wholehearted in our devotion to God in the years ahead. If we miss this last one, we miss everything else. Because God said, return to me with all your heart. How do you prepare for the day of the Lord? Return to me with all your heart. Rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord with all your heart as you prepare for the day of the Lord. As you prepare for coming crisis, return to the Lord. The Bible tells us at the end of the book that Jesus is coming for a church that will be like a bride. Why? Because his church will learn to love him wholeheartedly. Amen?